How's that? Is that okay? It's not for the people here, it's because of that, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, for those of you who are tuning in remotely online, you might notice we're in a different venue than we usually are. Normally on Friday night, we're at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. And tonight, we're beginning a series of lectures. Maybe a series, it could be that this is the only one, but the idea is to have a series of lectures at our new monastery, way place, vihara technically it's called. It's called the Redwood Vihara. It was quite unusual tonight. We were sitting in meditation before. Usually we hear the Berkeley High School football game, the cheerleaders and the band, and then we hear the guys with their cars running by and a few broken bottles and whatnot. And tonight you could hear a pine cone drop. It was so quiet up here. So obviously we're very removed from the noisy world in some ways. We're up in the Santa Cruz Mountains in Northern California. I think the nearest, what they would call a town, is miles away. We've had this place of land for a while, but just recently, through the hard work of a bunch of people and creative designs, we're actually turning this into a real Bodhimanda, a real place of the way. So tonight we're sitting in our new Buddha hall, which I don't know how much you can see, but it's really quite a remarkable space. And behind me sit three of the Buddhas that came from Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. I'm sure some of the Buddhas stayed behind because they liked the city, but three of them came here. These are the Ming Dynasty wooden Buddha statues you see behind you, very special. And obviously, to me, they look very much at home here. This is really a much better setting for them than in Berkeley. So there'll be a number of programs and retreats coming from this place. It's really wonderful. It's not that far from the Bay Area in terms of driving, but it is a world away in terms of activity and disturbance and noise and all the things that go with a busy urban setting. We have enough land to hopefully, what we're talking about is putting in hiking trails with stops along the way where people can just come and sit, do some meditation, write, do some photography, and kind of just wander through the acreage. A kind of ancient form of walking meditation. And the landscape here, and I'll go into that a little bit, is just kind of what people would call moderate rainforest, which is largely humongous redwood trees that then gather the moisture from the passing clouds and drop them on the ground below. But it also gets a lot of rain here during the rainy season, sometimes torrents. So this is the new way place. It's called Redwood Vihara. And tonight I wanted to start maybe with some reflections on the connections between this kind of natural setting, you might call the natural world, and then the inner natural world or the inner nature of people. And this theme, connecting the outer natural environment into what's called the zixing or the xing, the essential nature of what it means to be fully human, has a long tradition in Buddhism and in other traditions as well. And tonight I wanted to share some thoughts on that and also some quotes and passages to sort of anchor this a little bit and bring it to light. And what I'm using is not strictly from the received Buddhist tradition, but also other places that have resonated with me personally, because this particular blend of open outdoor wilderness, if you will, and inner landscape has been a huge part of my life since my earliest days. I grew up in a rather unsettled, open area of Wisconsin, spent almost all my summers on the farm, and was free to wander and roam through those hills. And for me, that was my first friendships, my first intimacies, so to speak, and my first teachers. So I feel very much at home here in the new Redwood Vihara. I wanted to start tonight with a simple poem. Actually, the title of this, of the talk, because I was asked to give a title, it's called The Mountain and Me. And then second title is Getting Lost in the Way. So let me deal with the first one as an actual poem. This is called The Mountain and Me. I'll read it first in English, then I'll come back to it. And fortunately, one of my students gave me the Chinese, so I will slobber through the Chinese, and you'll excuse my pronunciation, but sometimes the poetry of these verses is lost. The lyricism is lost in the translation, but not the meaning. So here's how it goes. The birds have vanished into the sky, and now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains. Very simple poem. In Chinese, if I can maybe get it, it's 中鸟高飞金，孤云独出闲，香港两不厌，只有敬亭山. And Shan is the character for the mountain. When I first heard this poem, it's written by a Chinese poet called Li Bai. Sometimes his name is Li Po. Around 725 Common Era. So this is quite a while ago from where we are. And yet to me, this rings just as true as it now that it did then. Interesting life. He wandered through the Yangtze River Valley, writing poetry and probably not living high off the hog, as we say. He had a good educational background. He was appointed to be a teacher at this academy, the Hanlin Academy, by the emperor, but soon was expelled from court and from his position. He then served a prince who also turned out to be rather problematic, who led a revolt, and that was put down. And so our poet here was arrested for treason, after which he was pardoned, and then again he returned to the Yangtze Valley to wander and write his poetry. So you see a full cycle here of starting out, wandering, reciting, and then getting engaged in a number of projects that did not turn out so well, and then returning. But you know, this is a key theme of these particular individuals, these spiritually inclined cultivators of the way. They have a mixture of a sensitivity for solitude, for mental concentration and contemplation, but also for poetry and writing and music and the arts. And they also turn out to be some of our earliest naturalists, that their paintings often depict and capture aspects of the natural world that nobody thought to capture before there was cameras. And I've always found these paintings to be particularly resonant and inspiring. But the other thing is that you see, I think from ancient times until the present company excluded, maybe not here, cultivators don't fit in very well. They're not a smooth fit with conventional society. And so try as they might, often their trajectory is they try to fit in, they try to do what's right, it's successful by those standards, and something grates and rubs, it just doesn't go down well. And so invariably they find themselves bouncing off from that, away from that. Sometimes in community, in a way you could say the Sangha is a community of misfits, in the positive sense, but also sometimes solitary. I remember my feeling of this as I grew up and as I got older in my teens and in my early 20s, the burden and the tension of this misfitting was palpable. It was just excruciating, actually. It's not that I couldn't be successful, but something inside me, every time I made steps into that arena, called me back. I could almost hear a voice saying, this is not true, this is phony, this is a game, this is a charade, a play. And so when I finally went to the monastery and became a monk, now I went from thinking that I didn't fit in the world, and then the world was now telling me I didn't fit into them. So it was a little reversal. And so everything about a monastic life, the hair, the clothes, the whole thing, is not normal. And so I became acutely aware that I didn't want to be normal, and that's why I went in. But then when I went in, I realized I really wasn't normal. Now I was abnormal in a new way. And so I remember saying to my teacher, I said, Master, everybody thinks we're kind of abnormal. And he looked at me and just smiled and he said, of course. What's so great about being normal? And then I remembered, I thought, yeah, that's exactly right, because when I was normal, it didn't feel so good. And being abnormal, although I got that sort of rejection from the world, I didn't have the cloud inside anymore. So it's a funny kind of thing. Anyhow, the thing I found about nature, even when I was a kid, and I find increasingly as I get older, it's the one place I can go where I can really be myself. The trees, the clouds, the streams, they don't judge me. They're not expecting me to be someone other than who I am. Now they put a certain pressure, but it's a constructive pressure to be real and to drop the pretenses and pretensions. But at the same time, there's a unconditional acceptance that nature offers. It doesn't have an agenda or program to turn you into something or somebody. So this poem by Li Bai, we could interpret a number of ways. We could interpret the way I experienced this as a child. I had even experiences like this as a child, but there's no way I could have put them into words. I tried once to write a poem about my experience like this for my class. It was 4th or 5th grade or something. And the sister, the good nun, looked at it and said, you're to be scolded for cheating. I said, what do you mean cheating? She says, obviously you didn't write this. You copied this from someplace else. And so she put me in the back. Wouldn't even let me present my poem to the class. 2 years later, my sister, my older sister, entered a poetry contest and stole that poem of mine, and then she won. And she would not give me credit. Oh no, I wrote it. So in any event, for the most part though, I couldn't express that inexplicable happiness and unity I felt of being in nature. So in a sense, you could hear at the Redwood Vihara or take this poem as just being an inexpressible quiet moment of being in nature. Or you can see it as something more, which I think it has, which is some kind of precise meditation or insight of witnessing the larger pattern of things. Sometimes in this tradition called the Tao, the way, the path, Magga. The birds then, the birds have vanished into the sky. Generally in a meditation tradition is the chattering thoughts have stopped because the birds are noise and chattering. When they vanish into the sky, it means that mind activity has stopped. The clouds is presented as what obscures or our desires, that filters. And when the clouds, the last cloud drains away, it should convey an image of an untainted open space, of totally blue skies, a pollution-free vision. And by the way, that pollution, that clouding, is actually a translation of the Sanskrit klesha, which are translated as those negative emotions and thought patterns that impede awakening, impede our natural bodhi. In Chinese, it's pan nao. So this could be seen as that. And then you can see this use of clouds, and that's part of what I wanted to talk about tonight, how rich this tradition is with images and metaphors from nature. And on one hand, they're metaphorical, but on another hand, there's something more going on. They're almost literal, and it's how we experience our mind and our nature through not the reading of text per se, but the reading of these experiences directly with mountains, trees, clouds, and so forth. So here's the part I wanted to talk about. You find this also in the Platform Sutra by Hui Neng. And Hui Neng, interestingly, wasn't really a poet. He was a great master and a teacher, but he was also illiterate. And so he had no kind of literary background like Li Po. Nonetheless, he had this direct perception, this direct understanding that he shared with his students. And one time he said to his students, as we're sitting here now, it was a very, and people take this as, oh, it was just rhetorical, but it wasn't. If you read the Sixth Patriarch, you knew he was hammer on steel. He was just always in the face, so to speak. And he said to the assembly, why don't you right now immediately see, right within your own mind, the true reality of your original nature? Why don't you right now, in this here place, immediately see your true self, see the true reality of your original nature, which is bright, pure, comprehensive in understanding, and unafflicted, not having greed and anger and fighting. Oh. And he wasn't saying, why don't you make a vow that next life you'll do that? Or why don't you think, well, next week I'll do that at the retreat? He says, right now, and this is called the direct teaching. Sometimes people call it sudden, but it's direct because it's going directly to here and now in you and not outside. And then he poses this and he says, he answers with this analogy drawn from the natural world. He says, why don't you? It is like when thick clouds obscure the sun, and if the wind doesn't blow, the sun cannot shine. That's his beginning. And so he's saying these clouds mentioned in the poem are sort of the self-inflicted impediments of delusion. These are the klesha, which we let cover over our fundamentally true, pure nature. There's a very beautiful simplicity to this language and to this assumption that we have an innate and inherent capacity for goodness, for virtue, for purity in the best sense of that, meaning a kind of wholeness, lacking nothing purity, rather than the idea of just moral purity. This purity in this tradition means whole and complete, lacking nothing, as if something's 100% pure and has no admixtures. So this idea, you find very much so, and nature is used as the mirror, as the reflecting device to remind us of that. So he says, the clouds of our afflictions obscure our nature in the same way we can't see our mind and our nature. And then he goes on, and I'll just read this passage. He says, it's like the sky above, which is always clear, and the sun and moon, which are forever bright. Even if they're obscured by floating clouds so they can't, the sky above remains clear, but the world below is overshadowed in darkness. A wind can suddenly come up, scattering the clouds. Then above and below are both bright, and everything reappears and becomes visible. So basically he's saying that the meditative practice, the spiritual life, the examined life, if you will, is like a wind that moves these clouds up, because the things that are bothering and afflicting us really aren't out there, but in here. And they're out there to the extent that we take them as real and attach to them. If we don't see them as real and not attached to them, there is this freedom that allows us to have right in that moment. So the opposite is true. And he says, good and wise friend, insight is like the sun and wisdom is like the moon. Insight and wisdom are always bright, but if we attach to externals, the floating clouds of errant thoughts cover over our essential nature, so it is obscured and cannot shine. So again, it's a contemplation that uses images from nature, but also one that's easily accessible as you work through this area, where in the morning the clouds are there and it's usually thick and covered over, and yet you forget that the sun is bright and shining over that. And then by midday, usually the heat of the sun and the wind blows the clouds off, and it becomes a kind of contemplative practice in and of itself. So I think that's probably one of the advantages maybe of cultivating in an environment like this, because it's hard to capture that feeling, that almost visceral poetic sense of who you really might be in settings where there isn't a natural exposure to the elements. And there's also a certain truth to nature that is lost in the artificial constructs. I mean, like the Nature Channel, or wherever you think you're going to access nature. Even the great things of the Green Planet, done by, what's his name? He just did it. David Attenborough. Really good. At the same time, you're sitting in your living room eating a pizza and trying to commune with nature through a TV screen with ads in between, and it's just not the same as being in a place like this. So I think the Redwood Vihara has the potential to get into this. The last one is the mountain, and my take on this, and you can read a poem like this in many ways, but the mountain seems to have the quality of something that's rooted and solid and lasting. And also in the imagery of the poets, the mountain is both deeply rooted in the earth, but then its peak touches the heaven. So it's this bridge space. The mountain is a bridge space between heaven and earth, between inner nature and sublime nature, if you want to use that. Also in the Avatamsaka, it has this wonderful expression. It says the tall mountains are like bodhisattvas, or really, really good people with good roots. When the sun rises in the morning, their peaks are the first to pick up the light. They're the first to spot the goodness, and they're the last to leave it as the sun sets. So these high peaks are considered to be sort of inspired and good human potential. And so it's probably something like, when the thoughts and the birds and the clouds are gone, a kind of absorption of it happens where one is lost, and I'm using quotation marks, in the abiding presence of the mountain. And there's something about a mountain, when you're in the mountains, whether you're moving in the mountains or quiet in the mountains, you feel this deep abiding presence, and it beckons you. It's not it can be threatening if you don't know what you're doing in the mountains, don't get me wrong, and that has happened to me a number of times. But that was my bad, not the mountains. Once I learned how to climb and work in the mountains, it became a good and friendly playground. But if you don't know what you're doing, things can happen. But that's true in the city. That's true at the university. I mean, it's true in a marriage. I don't know any place where that's not the case. But anyhow, so I think what the poem might be saying is, when the clouds, when the birds, and when the me is gone, only this remains. And that's the last line. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains. So this is the first poem I wanted to share tonight. with you. And it can be, and hopefully here at Redwood Vihara, we'll have enough space and views of mountains and woods and so forth to be able to make language like this actually catalytic. It can actually transform people. And people who come will write their own. They will have experiences like this in the purity of nature and write their own. The second one is this idea of getting lost. So the ancients would talk about people getting lost in the world, but they also talked about getting lost in the way. And they contrasted that. Getting lost in the world was truly like a slow death, a dying, because you lost your compass, you lost your bearings, and you're just being swept along by conditions. Getting lost in the way, as they described it, was a return, a recovery. And so this is a poem that comes from the Zhuangzi, and it goes like this. Fishes, they use plural, fishes are born in the water. A human being is born in the way, in the Tao. And this is referring to this inherent original nature. If fishes born in the water seek the deep shadow of pond and pool, all their needs are satisfied. If a person born in the Tao sinks into the deep shadow of, and this is translated as non-action, but what it really means is a sort of a freedom from aggression and desires, a natural way of responding to things as they truly are. It's called Wu Wei. And Wu Wei, sometimes literally without action, but what it means is without design, without calculation, without desires. And it's called the free and easy state, where you're in the world but not manipulating it and trying to transform it according to your greed and anger and so forth. So it's not meaning not action, it's action without design, without calculation. Something maybe closer would be artless. And so he says, then, and it goes on, you sink into the deep shadow of Wu Wei, you forget aggression and concern, you're free of desires and designs. That person lacks nothing, his life or her life is secure. And then the closing lines, which are really wonderful. All the fish needs is to get lost in the water. You're going to guess the last line, right? All the person needs is to get lost in the Tao, in the way. And so the idea is here to immerse oneself, to find your center and hold to it, and from that center respond, how shall I say, as the Platform Sutra says, everywhere engaged but nowhere grasping and attaching. So basically, what a place like this begins to offer is not only a place where the mountains, only the mountain remains, only the woods remain, only the creeks remain, but there's also this idea of getting lost in nature. And it's far enough away from the cities so that if you come here with pure intent, it's not too hard to get lost. And I don't mean literally getting lost, because that's not good either. We don't want to have search parties out looking for you. And then they come upon you and you say, you didn't find me. Because me is gone. No, okay, you go down that road. But to lose one's false sense of being by using nature as a companion and friend that invites you in to a safe and secure, broader and deeper sense of who you might be. Now, it's very interesting that Buddhist and other monastic communities, and across a wide variety of them, have been drawn to mountain sites, and it actually forms a backbone, at least in the Chinese Buddhists, but also others, of the tradition's conceptual geography. This is a kind of conceptual geography that's laid out. And the question is, why is this? Why did the monastics or the cultivators continue to go into these mountain sites and these forests and woods and so forth? The earliest cultivators were not in monasteries per se. So this is somewhat of a more settled place, but they were outdoors. They were in parks and groves and mountains and woods. Basically, they were backpackers. And sometimes backpackers without maps. In other words, even to have a map is to have too much of a design and too much of an intentionality. And so these were called Dhutanga wanderers, and by Dhutanga they meant they went through a kind of asceticism of simplifying their possessions and their load, and even their ambitions and desires, down to just the basics, so they could go freely wandering, but not lost, but lost in the sense of lost in the way, and begin to break their attachments to all these artificial constructs that we call civilization, to find a deeper civilization. It's not anti-civilization that they're doing. So even to the point, one of the Dhutanga practices, they would not stay for more than 3 nights under the same tree. How much the more build a condo, or establish that way. And so this wasn't, and it was a voluntary simplicity, a voluntary poverty, and it wasn't because they didn't have the wherewithal to do that. I mean, you look at Shakyamuni Buddha as the prince, clearly born into a whole palatial estate, but something gnawed inside, and so his beginning of his life of wandering and so forth is basically pulling up those phony roots to wander and not be tied down like this. Later, I'll share with you passages from a text called the Visuddhimagga, which is literally translated as a path of purification. And there's a wonderful chapter in there where describing the monks and nuns who take up this wandering, backpacking, if you will, and describes the joys and delights and psychological, emotional states that accompany this kind of living. Not time tonight. So the question is, what were they doing? What was this all about? Partly, they report, and I think any of you who have spent time in wilderness, really good, pristine wilderness, there are currents of energy and power there. And one of the texts describe it as power that can move and cut without harming. So there's something deep in the energy and the power of these areas. The rain also has a healing, nurturing quality. When I was in certain mountains like Omei-shan in China, this has natural herbs and medicines growing on the hillside that then become healers and sustenance. And they talk about this, and you can take it for whatever you will. I personally accept it, although initially I didn't, but I've had experiences that have convinced me that the spirits that are talked about as abiding in the trees and the woods and the mountains are actually real. I won't go into that. I could tell you many stories, and maybe on another night I will. But the spirits that are in those worlds also resonate and restore and challenge. And so it's a very interesting community. This is not, quote, solitude. In fact, going into a wilderness area is anything but, quote, literally being alone. You're just together in a different way. So the other thing they all report, which is very interesting, is that they shrink the ego. The ego is shrunk in proportion to the grandness or the scale of nature. And in fact, I'll share with you later, I just came upon this. UCSF did a study on the psychological, emotional changes that occur to people who spend a great deal of time in places like here. And one of the things they found, there's many things they found in terms of measuring the neurotransmitters and the hormones and so on and so forth. I always find it really interesting that somehow if we hear it from empiricism, we think it's better than our intuition. It's sort of like, well, empirically they show this, but intuitively people knew this a long time ago. I might even argue that our refined intuition is nothing but empiricism. Anyhow, I'm sorry to digress there. Anyway, one of the things they found is when they took selfie portraits out in the woods here, that the face and the body became smaller and smaller, and the background was larger and larger. So when they took pictures of themselves, it wasn't like, here I am at the disco with my friends. It was like nature got larger and larger, and they got smaller and smaller. And what they were concluding from this is that there's a reduction of self-inflation occurring naturally, And so what we're taking is pictures of our bigger self, so to speak, the mountains and the trees, of which we now identify as an extension rather than, a constriction of who we are. It's a really interesting phenomenon. So the other thing I would say, and for me this is really true, it was true when I was a child and it becomes true now. Every summer, it's almost part of my nutrient that I have to go to the wilderness, and fortunately, as my body doesn't jump through wilderness as easily anymore, we have a remote place in Maine that I spend, maybe a couple months in the summer. Really no electricity, and the water's still clean enough we can drink it right out of the lake. And it's surrounded by huge mountains and then these deep woods. And usually my only companion is the dog. And so it's very much like my child is wandering. But in the nothingness of there, a fullness returns that doesn't return anyplace else. And for better or for worse, I'm not at the state where all places are quite the same. Now, I can come back to the city after a month or two there and stay balanced for a while, but after a while without that, something gets eroded, something gets lost. So coming up here, even today as we were driving up, I could just feel that vibe and presence of the woods, the water, the air returning and working on me. The ancients called this homesickness. Very interesting. So the love of nature, the wanting of solitude, the going into the woods and the mountains was not so much a retreat as a return. And it was going back to one's home. So and this is from Hanshan. By the way, if we continue these lectures, I want to share the two Hanshans with you. There's two Hanshans. One is Hanshan De Ching, who was the great master during the time of Shakespeare, very learned and erudite, but also really drawn to nature and wrote some of the finest nature essays and poetry of his time. And then there's Hanshan Cold Mountain, who only wrote poems in the mountains, didn't have that kind of education, and they both have the name Hanshan. And so I've been working with them, not literally working with them, I've been working with their writings and just looking at their thoughts. And so much of what they write about is about what we're trying to recreate here. So this is from Hanshan De Ching. And he says, put a fish on land and the fish will remember the ocean until he dies. Put a bird in a cage and he will not forget the sky. Each remains homesick for his true home, the place where his nature has decreed he or she should be. I really love this section. You take a fish out of the water, the fish remembers the water, the ocean. You take a bird and put it in a cage, the bird will not forget the sky. And you take each is hungry for their true home. But he says, same true with people. Each has a nature, a home that's decreed where they should be, and we are unsettled and not content until we're able to return to that. So part of coming here, and I remember last week we were talking to some of the volunteers who came to work. I just like it here. It's so cool. It's just refreshing. I feel at home. They weren't quite sure why they kept coming all that distance to come here. But what it was homesickness. And it's a homesickness not only for the natural world, but what the natural world is a portal to is to the nature, the self-nature. And so we don't have to be eloquent and explain why it is. We just have to be open to it and let it work on us. So a little bit, vihara, I don't know how you chose that name. It's a kind of interesting, could have been called Bodhimanda, could have called temple, could have called monastery, but vihara. How did vihara come up? Because it sounds cool, or? Yes? Okay,
so the reason was we were actually thinking of calling it something like Redwood Brahma Vihara. Because we thought
an expression on a Brahma Vihara, the
Brahma
four
Vihara
limited
is
minds.
Four limitless hearts, or boundless hearts. And so we talked about, we thought having Redwood Brahma Vihara was maybe just too much to say.
That would be, especially on letters. Dear Brahma Vihara.
But we thought that's actually our true home, just dwelling in the hearts of kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And so after we had Redwood Vihara, first we started with Redwood Chan Monastery, but we thought that was a little bit of a mouthful. So we went with Redwood Vihara. Yeah.
Okay.
True abidings. And I would say when we avoid and abide in these hearts, we can really feel in ourselves, in our home.
Yeah, that's real home.
Okay. Well, so being a historian, I always like to do etymologies and things. But vihara, actually, another word for vihara is refuge. And it's a residence, interestingly, to walk around in. So vihara originally was a residence to walk around in and discuss and investigate. During the rainy season, in the earliest times of Buddhism, these were the shelters that were put up, literally like base camps, if you will, for the wanderers. So if you again think of this, tents are put up, tents become roofs, roofs become walls, walls become doors and windows, and then you have keys and locks, and then eventually you have a monastery. But originally, these were just basically shelters from the rain, because the monks would wander throughout until the rainy season. When the rainy season, they didn't wander anymore, they settled. One reason was it's a bummer to be wandering in the rain. Come on, I mean, it looks good on TV, but when you're out there and getting wet. But also that's when all the bugs and things would come out and wander, and they would step on them, and they had this feeling of ahimsa, not harming, so they didn't want to harm all the creatures that were coming out during the flood. So they would gather during the rainy seasons, and during that time they would discuss and share with each other and recall the teachings they had, and often this became how the teachings became written down. But it was basically a wandering, open-ended existence. And then the vihara then became, it's a Sanskrit term, basically a secluded place in which to walk. So they could still walk, but it was secluded and sheltered to some degree. So it referred then, by extension, to the dwellings or the refuges, if you think about it. If you've ever been, I remember I was backpacking one time, and I got caught literally in a typhoon off the coast of California. It was such a wind and rain that I could stand on the cliff's edge and lean over and not fall, because the wind was just holding me up. I was stupid. If it broke, I would have fallen over. But I was young and crazy. And I was like leaning like that, and the rain, and I put my tent up. Oh my God. And the wind was so strong it blew off my top covering. And then I remember at night I felt something touching my nose. I thought, oh, I wonder what that is. And it was a tent. Just the water had just come and dropped the whole tent on me, and then whoosh, came through. So I packed up everything. I was cold, I was shivering, and I knew I had to walk, and suddenly I saw a cabin in the distance with a light on. It was a ranger's cabin. I knocked on the door. She looked at me and said, "Oma, you're a pitiful sight. Come on in." Gave me oatmeal and let me dry out. It was a refuge. So the idea here is that the vihara was a refuge for the wandering monks during that rainy season. And the northern state of Bihar, India, takes its name from vihara, because there were so many viharas in that area due to the abundance of the monasteries in that area. So usually, though, a vihara was rather simple. Now, it's not like the grand temples, but it usually had a few lodgings places. It had a sima, which is very important, a sacred boundary that was held to enclose it. And sometimes ceremonies, and a kitchen and a dining room, but very simple. And interestingly, it was available to lay people as well as to monastics. And so the laity could come there and cultivate, live together, and more importantly, discuss and study, and renew and refresh themselves before going back out. So all of that, whether you intended this to be the case for this name here, it really fits this area, this ground. I can tell I won't have time to go into all I wanted to do tonight. So, if there's enough interest in this, I'll continue these talks, because if nothing else, I'll talk to myself, because I just find it really satisfying to investigate this, and also to discover that my leanings and longings are not so unusual, that these are not only shared by people today, but they have an ancient heritage going way back. Some of the best and brightest minds. I was going to quote Emerson and Thoreau and others tonight. I'm just going to have to wait on that. But there is a community, a fellowship, if you will, of men and women throughout time who have found themselves in nature again, rediscovered themselves, written about it. And I'll just say one thing, and I'll go into this next week. The Buddha is born under a tree, outdoors, under the sala tree, and attains perfect enlightenment also under a tree. And for most of his life was under trees or wandering. And so you could say, well, I guess that was just the thing of the times. I don't think so. I think it was actually purposeful. I think there's something about this. So I'll go into this next week. The only thing I'll finish tonight is with something that comes from actually my grandmother, who was Irish, and she had a very strong belief in the connection between the ordinary world and the spiritual world. Her life consisted of prayers, meditations, readings. She was a school teacher where she was constantly both seeing and cultivating a connection between the ordinary and the extraordinary, or what we might call heaven and earth, inner and outer. And of course, being Irish, she had ways of rendering this that some would call superstitious. Nonetheless, as a child, I really liked hearing her stories and hearing her describe some of the places she'd been. But this comes from her tradition, and it's called thin places, T-H-I-N, thin places. And thin places is used across traditions. It's describing that there's a line or border between heaven and earth, or between the sacred and the profane, or the mundane and the supermundane. Very, very thin line. And there are places on earth called thin places. These are locales where the distance between this divide collapses, almost to the point that it's not only negligible, but non-existent. And we're able in those places to catch a glimpse of what we call the divine, the transcendent, the expansive and awesome. This is the avatamsaka state that describes where worldly and world transcending interpenetrate without obstruction. And so bodhimandras, especially bodhimandras in the areas like this, were usually chosen, and the place was selected because it was a natural thin place. So the bodhimandra was set up in a place in these mountains. Like if you go to the sacred mountains, you get in the mountains and already you feel something. There's something about that place. And then you notice that that's where the ancient temples and monasteries were. So these people, these cultivators who were sensitive, and I say sensitive, not imaginary, but sensitive to these forces and elements, would naturally gravitate towards them. And later I'll give this passage by Han Shan De Ching. He was wandering and came upon this mountainous area, was hiking through it, and said, my gosh, this has just got such wonderful energy. And then he explored it and found out that it had been a neglected place way hundreds of years earlier. And then he started to see the ruins, and then he restored it, and he never wanted to leave there. So these thin places occur in nature. It could be a mountaintop, it could be a meadow, it could be a woods, or the ocean. There's something where all of a sudden you feel that boundary thin out to almost disappearing. And so way places in what are called bodhimandras, which are places of awakening, are often in these mountainous wooded areas. And that's why you'll see, even in the Chinese, you'll see shan, mountain, used to describe Mount Omeshan, Wutaishan, Putoshan, Chowashan. The place is called mountain. It's actually called mountain. The other word that's used is the picture of two trees, lin. So you have Baolin, Shaolin, these monasteries. So they actually, in their character and their titles, are essentially pointing to the connection between the natural world and the inner nature cultivated world. And I would say this is the case here for Redwood Vihara. And the other thing they said, which is very interesting, when people cultivate here, really sincerely cultivate, a thick place becomes a thin place. So you actually thin it out. The converse is true. A thin place Don't it always go to show you don't know what you got till it's gone? They pave paradise and put up a parking lot. This song, you know, it's this idea that you can take a thin place and you can make it into a thick place by developing it. So anyhow, I'll stop there tonight. There's so much more I'd like to share with you. If you're interested, we can pick this up again either next week or further weeks, but that's it for tonight. But I think you have some more that you want to do tonight, right?
Yeah, we had a slideshow. We were asked to put together a slideshow of Redwood Vihara. And I don't know if, Marty, you knew that the Chinese name for Redwood Vihara is Hongmu Chanling. That's the ling right there, the two trees.
Translate.
So literally translated as Hongmu is redwood, and
Mu is
Tan,
wood.
Tan is Chan, and Ling is forest. So we first thought of the name as Redwood Chan Monastery, but we thought Redwood Vihara was easier to say and kind of capture the heart of what we wanted to nurture here.
Wonderful.
So, okay, so we're going to show the slideshow. Yeah, please use that one for those online, and I'm going to use probably this computer for those here. So you have to
I'm
use
going to
the
read
video.
a poem before you show, because I had the advantage of seeing your
Turn on the light. Oh, okay.
the video you're going to show. So here it is. And I'll read the poem and then you can show
Okay.
the video. But think of this poem. This poem's by the other Hanshan, Cold Mountain. Okay, and it goes like this. If you want to attain a peaceful life, settle down at Cold Mountain. Subtle breezes blow through the mysterious pine. Listen closely. The sound is really good. Beneath it, that sound, beneath those trees and sound, someone with graying hair reads the Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu without ceasing. After 10 years, I can never return. I've even forgotten the way I came. That forgetting is when I'm that lost. I can't go back to where I was. I even forgot how to get back. That's wonderful. Okay, go ahead. You want to put it up? You can put it in front of my face. I don't care. Got to dim the lights a little, right? What about up here, just removing this temporarily? Sorry, no popcorn, but can you dim the lights a little, or can you take the lights down a little bit? Okay. Am I in your way? Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. Start again. Okay, so just to explain the slideshow a little bit, people saw on the slides there was one picture with a white tree. It wasn't very big. It's probably just maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. And our neighbor Dan says it's an albino redwood. And because he says there's not very many of them, but they actually don't make their own chlorophyll, which means that they actually can't create sustenance for themselves. So they're actually nurtured by the rest of the forest, rest of the redwood trees, because the redwood trees' roots actually intertwine and support one another. So that sustenance goes to that albino tree. So it's, and I think another image for us at Brother Vihara is that here all our roots intertwine and we support each other. You know, when one of us is maybe feeling a little bit down, the other ones can kind of get a little bit of support. When it's a little bit too excited, we can calm ourselves down.
The joke is in the monastery, not everyone is depressed at the same time. So,
Exactly. So I don't know. The other one was there was one tree that people might have seen that was kind of really twisted a little bit. We heard that was actually old growth, meaning it's been for many, many years. Could be hundreds. Yeah.
Marty, do you want, you says that you was when the Master Hua came and saw these two trees when we saw. Can you share a bit with that? Okay, next time. Okay.
Yeah, but the tree is, you can see, very twisted, and so it wasn't cut down when this place was logged a couple of times, and so we still have some old growth on the property. Other than that, I think it's
Well,
just.
if you look like old growth, you're not be able to put to such good use.
Yeah, and maybe you'll survive. You won't get swallowed up by society. Okay, so maybe it's that much. It's very nice. We can finish with the hands in the Samadhi Mudra and do our dedication of merit.
Just one line. You can see this Buddha's smile, and I think they have another reason to be happy because it was the very first time when Dharma was spoken here in this hall. So the Dharma is turning.
Yep. Okay. And in the future, we can be showing you the stained glass that we'll be putting in over time. So stay tuned. Yeah.
I would normally join the bowing, but I can't right now because
Yeah.
injury, so I don't want to.
Okay. Okay, so let's do the dedication of merit. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.